On December 25, 1991, the red flag of the Soviet Union was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. To the rest of the world, it looked like a political collapse. But if you looked at the ledger books inside the Ministry of Finance, you would have seen a different story. The Soviet Union didn't die because of an ideology. It died because it ran out of money. This is the story of the greatest bankruptcy in human history. It is the story of a superpower that possessed 40,000 nuclear warheads but couldn't afford to buy bread. It is a lesson on what happens when a nation becomes addicted to a single resource. To understand how a superpower goes broke, we have to go back to the moment they thought they were rich. The year was 1965. In the frozen wastelands of Western Siberia, Soviet geologists made a discovery that would change the fate of the 20th century. They found oil, specifically the Samotlor field. It wasn't just an oil field. It was a sea of black gold. At the time, this seemed like a miracle. The Soviet economy was already slowing down. The communist system was struggling to produce consumer goods. Growth rates that had averaged 6% in the 1950s were sliding toward 3% by the mid-1960s. Factories were producing tractors nobody wanted and refrigerators that didn't work. The Lada automobile plant in Togliatti was manufacturing cars that broke down within months. Television sets from the Horizon factory in Minsk had failure rates of 40%. The collective farms were failing to meet grain quotas year after year. But suddenly, with Samotlor pumping 3 million barrels per day by 1980, they didn't need to produce good cars or televisions. They just needed to drill holes in the ground. Throughout the 1970s, the price of oil skyrocketed. The OPEC embargo against the West sent prices through the roof, and the Soviet Union became the biggest beneficiary. In 1973, oil traded at $3 a barrel. By 1980, it hit $35. Billions of dollars in hard currency flooded into Moscow. Between 1973 and 1985, Soviet oil exports generated over $300 billion in revenue. It was the greatest lottery win in the history of the Russian state. But this wealth was a curse. It masked the rot. Because the oil money was so easy, the Soviet leadership stopped trying to fix their broken economy. Why reform the factories when you can just sell oil? Why fix agriculture when you can just sell oil? The Soviet Union became a petrostate. It was essentially a third-world economy with first-world rockets. By 1980, oil and gas accounted for 80% of Soviet hard currency earnings. The numbers tell the story of addiction. In 1970, manufactured goods made up 15% of Soviet exports. By 1985, that figure had fallen to 4%. They stopped making things the world wanted to buy. Grain from America, machinery from Germany, consumer goods from Japan. They were exporting raw materials and importing everything else: grain from America, machinery from Germany, consumer goods from Japan. Even simple items like shoes and clothing were being imported. They were trading the blood of the earth for food, for machines, and for silence. The leadership in the Kremlin used the oil windfall to buy loyalty. They subsidized food prices, keeping bread artificially cheap at 20 kopecks per kilogram when the actual cost of production was over a ruble. They subsidized housing, charging citizens 5% of income when the real cost was 10 times that. They subsidized meat, milk, and sugar. The state was spending 60 billion rubles annually on food subsidies alone by 1985. They subsidized their satellite states in Eastern Europe, pumping billions into Poland, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia to keep the Warsaw Pact intact. Cuba received $4 billion a year. Vietnam got $2 billion. They built a massive military machine that consumed 20% of GDP. It was a golden age, but it was built on a foundation of sand. The entire stability of the Soviet Union was pegged to one number: the price of a barrel of oil. As long as oil was over $30 a barrel, the Soviets were rich. They were invincible. They could invade Afghanistan. They could threaten Europe. They could race the Americans to space. But that number was about to change, and when it did, everything would unravel. The first cracks appeared in 1981. By 1982, they had fallen to $32 a barrel. Not a crisis yet, but a warning. The Soviet Ministry of Finance began running deficit projections. If oil fell below $25, they would need to cut subsidies. If it fell below $20, they would need to borrow. If it fell below $15, the system would collapse. These projections were classified. They were never shown to the Politburo. The bureaucrats hoped the price would recover. It didn't. In 1985, Saudi Arabia made a decision that would kill the Soviet Union. They decided to flood the market. Saudi Arabia opened the taps. Production surged from 2 million barrels per day to over 10 million. And the price of oil went into free fall. By January 1986, oil had crashed to $10 a barrel. The Soviet Union lost $20 billion in annual revenue overnight. That's equivalent to losing the entire economy of Finland in a single year. The Soviet state was now hemorrhaging money. The budget deficit exploded from 2% of GDP to over 10%. The Ministry of Finance calculated they were losing $100 million per day. But the leadership couldn't admit this. They couldn't tell the Soviet people that the superpower was broke. Admitting economic failure would be admitting ideological failure. So they did what every failing state does. They printed money. The Ministry of Finance began running the printing presses day and night. The money supply expanded by 30% between 1985 and 1987. In 1988 alone, they printed 27 billion rubles with no corresponding increase in goods or services. Rubles flooded into circulation, but there was nothing to buy with them. The Soviet economy didn't produce enough consumer goods even when times were good. Domestic production of televisions, washing machines, and basic household items had stagnated for a decade. Now, with import capacity collapsing, the stores were emptying. By 1987, the shortages had become systemic. Sugar disappeared from the shelves in Moscow. Then butter. Then meat. In Leningrad, meat appeared in stores only twice a month. In provincial cities like Sverdlovsk and Kuibyshev, it was once a month. Citizens began hoarding. People stockpiled soap, matches, light bulbs, anything that might become scarce. Apartments became storage units. Lines formed outside stores before dawn. People waited for hours to buy a single bar of soap or a bottle of cooking oil. The average Soviet citizen spent 40 hours per month standing in lines. Women would abandon their place in one line to join another when they spotted a delivery truck. Children were kept home from school to hold places in queues. The black market exploded. A pair of Western jeans that cost 15 rubles in a state store sold for 200 rubles on the street. A bottle of French cognac went for 150 rubles when the average monthly salary was 200. But even on the black market, goods were vanishing. The entire distribution system was breaking down. Truck drivers were diverting shipments. Store managers were selling inventory directly to black marketeers. The official economy and the shadow economy had merged into one dysfunctional system. The government tried to hide the crisis with accounting tricks. They stopped publishing real economic data in 1987. They invented new categories of hidden inflation to make the numbers look better. They claimed the economy was still growing at 2% per year, when in reality it was contracting by 5%. But you can't lie to grocery stores. You can't fake bread. The Soviet people could see the truth every time they opened an empty refrigerator. The subsidies that had kept the system stable were now destroying it. The government was still selling bread for 20 kopecks when it cost them 2 rubles to produce. They were still charging 5% of income for housing when it cost 50% to maintain. They were still sending billions to Eastern Europe when they couldn't feed their own citizens. The gap between what the state spent and what it earned was widening every month. In 1985, the subsidy bill was 60 billion rubles. By 1989, it had doubled to 120 billion. And there was no way to close it without triggering a political explosion. Mikhail Gorbachev understood this. When he came to power in 1985, he inherited an economy that was already on life support. The budget deficit was spinning out of control. Foreign debt was mounting. His reforms, perestroika and glasnost, were desperate attempts to resuscitate a dying patient. He tried to restructure the economy, to make it more efficient, to introduce market mechanisms. But every reform made things worse. When he allowed small private businesses, it exposed how inefficient the state enterprises were. When he lifted censorship, it revealed how corrupt the system had become. When he reduced military spending, it eliminated the only sector of the economy that worked. The Soviet Union needed $50 billion a year just to service its foreign debt. But oil revenues had collapsed to $30 billion. They needed to import 40 million tons of grain annually to feed the population, but they didn't have the hard currency to buy it. Western banks were now demanding payment up front. Letters of credit were being rejected. They needed spare parts for their factories, but Western suppliers were demanding payment up front. The entire economy was running on credit, and the credit was running out. In 1989, the Soviet Union defaulted on its international obligations for the first time. Not officially. They just stopped paying. Commercial shipments from Western Europe began to slow. Credit lines were frozen. The Soviet state was now in a death spiral. Less revenue meant less imports. Less imports meant more shortages. More shortages meant more hoarding. More hoarding meant the economy seized up further. The satellite states were the first to break. Poland, Hungary, and East Germany had been subsidized by Moscow for decades. When the subsidies stopped, their governments collapsed.